Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Panel. This panel is hosted by ECOS, an employee resource group at Esri, and we focus on sustainability and intersectional environmentalism. We're so excited to be hosting our very first SIG at User Conference. My name is Grace Bouchong, my pronouns are she, her, and I co-founded ECOS in 2019 with Ashley Dew, who's also on this call. We will be both moderating the panel. I will facilitate discussion and Ashley will be monitoring the chat and Q&A. We will have 45 minutes for discussion and then 15 minutes at the end for questions. We want to get a feel of where everyone is coming from to this discussion, so please fill out the poll in the sidebar if you haven't done so yet. To get started, we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the lands that we are all currently on. We're in many locations right now. So the Serrano people, currently San Manuel Band of Mission Indians in Redlands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute, the Nishanan, Maidu, and Miwok, the Massachusetts, and the Pawtucket. We would like to encourage everyone to learn the history of your own region. You can see whose land you are on in the Native Lands map we will link to at the bottom of the story map. We also want to recognize that not all perspectives are represented at this panel. We celebrate the diversity of the community and recognize everyone's intersectional identities. We hold that any discussion about justice is incomplete without understanding and addressing the barriers that often simultaneously exist around gender identity, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and other social identities. This panel does not represent all experiences. We are here to learn from one another and make Esri a safe place for everyone. And now let's get started with introductions from our panelists. Vero, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Véronique Couttee. I go by Vero also, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently a geospatial and equity tech consultant, and I'm actually joining from very far from Mauritius Island, which is east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And I can't tell you how excited I am to be on this panel. I've already had the chance to have a conversation with a fellow panelist, and it was already really inspiring. So thank you so much for having me here.
Great. Jaimie, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Grace. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jaimie Huynh. I am an environmental scientist here at Cal Recycle. My main line of work is an environmental justice liaison for my division, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Gabby? Gabby, you might be on mute. We'll come back to Gabby. Kate, would you like to go?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. My name's Cate Mingoya, and I'm the Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA, which is the national support organization for 22 people-centered environmental justice organizations. And I am here in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is about a 20-minute bike ride north of Boston. And I'm so thrilled to be here with you. Thanks for coming today.
Okay. Gabby, can you hear us?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm so sorry, my internet.
Oh no.
Oh, we lost you, Gabby.
It's wacky. Now the worst possible moment.
Okay. We can see you now. I guess chime in as you can with the internet issues. So let's get started. We wanted to start off with defining environmental justice. So environmental justice is a movement that grew from the recognition of a disproportionate number of environmental burdens in certain communities. It works to ensure a healthy environment for all, regardless of race, nationality, income, gender, or age. The principles of environmental justice call for fairness regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the development of laws and regulations that affect every community's natural surroundings and the places people live, work, play, and learn. And it looks like most people have answered the poll at this point. So we have 60% of people somewhat familiar with environmental justice but want to learn more. 30% are new to environmental justice, and then about 10% were work in environmental justice already. Okay, let's get started with our first question. How did you get involved with environmental justice?
I can jump in. So I grew up actually in Queens, New York, the like Fran Drescher part, if anyone's like old enough to remember The Nanny as a show. And the neighborhood that I grew up in was one that had a lot of contaminated sites, a lot of industry, car repair places. There was one tree that was on the end of our block that the boys and girls would like fight and like beat the crap out of each other to sit under in the summer so that we could have some shade. And I was told by the adults in my life, you need to go to school, you need to get an education, you need to get a good career so that you can get out of this neighborhood and you can have more choice over where you live and live in a safer space. And I swallowed that entirely. I did exactly what the adults in my community told me to do it. And I left my neighborhood. I went to college, got a degree, came back as a public school teacher and taught in the same or in really similar communities to the ones that I grew up in the South Bronx and in East New York. And I found myself telling my students the same thing that I was told. You need to go to college, you need to get a good job, you need to leave this neighborhood. These were neighborhoods that were really hot, that did not have a lot of parks. You were more likely to find a burnt out couch than a park bench on the side of the walk. And it took me about 4 years to realize what a horrible thing that is to say to a kid, to say that you need to leave your community, you need to leave your family, you need to leave your language, you need to leave everything that you're familiar with so that you can live in a space that's physically safe and that has economic prosperity. And that is what caused me to transition my career from being a middle school science teacher into working in urban planning and focusing on climate mitigation and environmental justice work. And the work that I do at Groundwork USA is very focused on the idea that communities that are overburdened with environmental justice issues, the people there are whole and complete people that have a vision for what they want their communities to look like, and they need folks to invest in their community and invest in them. They are inherently whole and wonderful people that have really great ideas about how to change the world. We just need to amplify the voices they already have because the system is designed to ignore them. So that's a path that I got to environmental justice, and I've been working here for Groundwork USA for about 3 years, and I've been a planner for about 8.
I will also I will jump in after Cate because it's kind of crazy. We definitely didn't grow up in the same part of the world. I grew up on the other side of the world, and yet it's the same story. And I find it surprising how, growing up in Mauritius, I was also pushed this narrative that you cannot become anything if you stay. You cannot become anything if you live in your community, you will not prosper, and you need to get the Western world education to make something of yourself. So that was a big part of it. And I also believed it. And I was responsible for a lot of implicit biases against my own community growing up because of that. And I remember growing up in a community that didn't have access to healthy outdoor spaces and discovering conservation. That was a very privileged space to be in Mauritius because it's not an accessible space. You're basically expected to volunteer, to buy your own gear and to lead that life. And I was like, well, conservation don't care. And that's what I kept thinking. Education, I wanted to study environmental leadership. And it's like opening Pandora's box. I started to see like, to see that it's not so much about they don't care. Caring the way that conservation say caring is a privilege. People have to like think about their basic needs first. And this is kind of what got me. I never think I'm into environmental justice as a career. Like, I don't really think about those terms because there's so many terms out there, EDI and equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I do know one thing is I'm tired of the narrative that local communities don't have a lot to give. Like historically excluded communities don't have a lot to give, and they don't have a lot of unique perspective to bring to the table. So that is what brings me to do environmental justice work.
Hi, I'll go next. It's amazing how I'm just meeting all of you, and a lot of our stories are very, very similar in ways. I grew up in a little city in Los Angeles County, and growing up in this area, it's all Asian Americans and Mexican Americans in this area. And I am always baffled by the number of facilities, diesel trucks, lack of parks that are around this neighborhood, and freeways intersecting straight through our communities. And I started in the world of climate science and hoping to really address some of these issues that I saw growing up. And all of these issues are systemic. We see it to this day. People of color are always the people that get the brunt of environmental burdens. And so it is my job, my passion in government to make sure we undo these inequities and these systems that put people in this position to begin with. Thank you.
I can go ahead and share, Grace, or is that okay?
Yeah,
okay,
go
perfect.
ahead.
Thank you so much. And I'll actually introduce myself. I'm Gabriel Mendez with the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, She, Hers. And I'll quickly tag on to this. I got involved in environmental justice when I was around 11 years old. I didn't know that that's what it was, particularly. I just noticed there was something different in my community, right? When I would travel to different parts, like in Orange County or areas that are wealthier, right? I noticed that there was differences, and I wondered why those things weren't available to me. And then I was getting involved through like city beautifications. It was more through land rather than health. But of course, both those things are connected directly. So that's how I started to get involved in environmental justice. And growing up in this area, my area is actually a red zone on the Kellen Barrow screen. I started seeing a lot of my neighbors were sick. I started seeing a lot of things that were going wrong, and I started questioning, right? I started wondering, well, why is this happening here? This is not normal. Why is this normalized? And yeah, just going through high school and dealing with this and hearing from my friends, neighbors, family, and then continuing to be involved socially, I started seeing the interconnections, and that's what drove me to this work.
Great. And I'm wondering if now we could maybe did any of you have anything to add to the environmental justice definition? Just because it seems like there's a lot of people here who might be new to the idea of environmental justice. Anybody like to chime in about that?
Yeah, I know it does feel like a very daunting task, environmental justice. And a lot of people like, well, I already have a lot to do and a lot to try and save on this planet. So adding environmental justice as a job feels like an extra task, but it's costing all of us like to not think about environmental justice. Like systemic injustices is costing all of us. And one thing you can start with is the self-work and the healing that comes with your own diversity story, because that's it. Everyone has a diversity story. Maybe like your family background, like your religion, and in this space right now, we're already finding a lot of common grounds in between all of us. And it's about doing this healing work, and it's about doing this common ground work that makes it that we can be more effective with how we collaborate with each other. So that is something that I wanted to add, is like, if you don't know where to start with yourself, start about learning about your own history and, working through the things that you struggle to work with your implicit biases, and discovering those biases through all the resources that exist out there.
And if I could add on to that, Gabriela, I think that's a really great direction to learn and do some searching. And I'd encourage folks to also do some search into the history of why your neighborhood looks the way that it does. Because your neighborhood actually doesn't look like this by accident. There's usually a really strong connection. One of the things that we do in my work at Groundwork USA is under our Climate Safe Neighborhoods partnership, which is in 13 cities across the United States, is to look at historical race-based housing segregation. And we use redlining maps as a proxy for that. If you're not familiar with redlining, you can find a lot of great information about it online, but it was basically a way that the federal government subsidized usually whiter, wealthier folks for home ownership and denied that to usually lower income Black and brown folks and immigrant people. Look it up if you don't know much about it. And we find that the relationship between historical race-based housing segregation, with or without redlining, connects pretty closely to the way that we're experiencing the climate crisis. So on average, neighborhoods that were formerly redlined, so Black and brown neighborhoods in the 1930s, are about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, international people, I don't know my centigrade, on average hotter than neighborhoods that were formerly greenlined, but that can be as much as 20 degrees on the same day in the same city. You're talking about walking a couple blocks and going from a place where you don't have to use your air conditioner to one that you do. Going from a place where your utility bill for cooling is maybe $150 at the end of July, and one where it's going to be $250. One where it's safe for your kids to play outside, and one where it's not. And so the thing that I really want to emphasize is that when we're talking about environmental justice, these things didn't spring fully formed from the head of Zeus, right? Like that's not the way that they came. There's usually a systemic reason why they happen. And there's a reason why those impacts still play 60, 100, 250 years later. So look into why your community looks the way that it does. Why do your neighbors, why are they the race they are? Why are they the income they are? What's going on with your city? What's going on with your state?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kate and Vero. That was really good additional stuff to think about. Real quick, I just want to touch on, I know a couple of you use GIS. Kate, you mentioned the Groundworks USA Climate Safe Neighborhoods, which we will have linked at the bottom of the story map when we share it out. It's really cool work. I encourage everyone to check that out. Does anyone want to talk about how they have gotten involved with GIS or used GIS?
Sure, I'll start. So GIS was actually first offered to me during college, and I was lucky enough to be able to take those courses. And I just thought, oh, it's just mapping. Like, what am I going to get out of this? I'm putting dots on the map. Like, why does this matter? And after seeing more examples, actually working with communities, working with state government, working with more people, I was like, oh, actually, maps can have a really huge impact. And one of the things I worked with at the California Environmental Protection Agency is a story map and map on redlining and its association with environmental burdens using, I think, Gabby, you mentioned earlier, CalEnviroscreen. And so we connected the two to see redlining, 1930s. Okay, how does that connect to today? How have we failed as an environmental agency to protect people from environmental burdens all these years? And so this story map, I don't know if you have the link to include it on this here, but it explores the data behind it. And I think it's very, very powerful to see the historic outlines of these redlined areas, to connect the appraisals written by the appraisers back in the 1930s, calling Black and brown folks just infiltrations, using terrible words to describe us. And I think it's so powerful to see that to this day, nothing has really changed as far as planning. Like what Kate mentioned earlier, there's a lot of systemic policies that were applied to a lot of where we live. And that's why it looks the way it does today. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jaimie. Anyone else want to chime in on this question, or we can move on?
One of the things that's been so surprising. So I got involved in GIS. Like I went to planning school and everyone has to take it. I'd never heard of it before. And I thought it was pretty cool. I'm okay at it. I'm not a whiz. Really, all the maps on our website are done by this great guy named Lawrence, who's our GIS guy. But I figured out how to use the maps with actual human beings, because I actually think maps by themselves are not particularly useful. There needs to be a story or a narrative around it to help interpret and make sense of what these, to your point, dots on a map look like. And one of the things that's been so surprising to me about our Climate Safe Neighborhoods partnership, the goals of which are to help us understand why our communities look the way that they do, and that since they don't look like this by accident, they're not going to change by accident. So what do we do to build our capacity to intervene in these systems so that this harm can't happen again, is how much these maps can serve as a neutral platform for conversations about equity. We do a lot of community organizing, door knocking, talking to folks, elected officials, residents, and we run into people who maybe don't believe in the climate crisis, or maybe who don't believe that structural or systemic racism exists. And when you're able to show folks this direct connection between environmental issues and historical documentation and historical decisions, you'll all of a sudden have this neutral platform that says, this is not personal to you, because we are not really great about talking about race in the United States. We have not cracked that nut yet as a people, and it can be really personal and understandable because it's been a pretty rough 250 years for the way we've interacted with each other. And these maps allow us to not view it as, hey, I'm blaming you for this, or I feel bad about what this happened. It's, we've got a problem, and it doesn't matter whether our political views are the same or not. Like, we're occupying the same space, and there's a real big problem. And it's been shocking to me that folks who don't believe in the climate crisis all of a sudden are really concerned about how different communities are experiencing heat and extreme precipitation. And folks who don't believe in historical race-based housing segregation, or don't believe in the fact that structural racism still exists, can't really explain why 2/3 of our communities that were historically redlined are still majority minority today, and why 75% of those communities are still low to moderate income communities. It forces these conversations where we really have to reckon. So I'm a really big evangelist and believer in using these, in using maps as platforms for conversation. They're not the be all and end all. They're not the only way to make decisions. They're a way to facilitate really great conversation between residents, the folks who should be in the driver's seat or making decisions about what their community looks like, and the people who currently hold the power. But we're looking to sort of flip that and change it a little bit, bust those systems so the power is a little more distributed. So that's my GIS story.
Perfect. Thanks, Kate. Okay, let's move on to some discussion about current justice issues. Can use this as a jumping off point, but what justice issues are you currently working on? I know we've heard a little from some of you about this already. Vero?
Yeah, I was, so a big thing for me is, as moving forward, as a Creole woman, so a Creole woman is a person from African and descent and Indian descent in Mauritius, and we don't represent a huge percent of the population, about 26% for a population of 1.3 million. So a big thing that I want, and it kind of touches a bit with what Kate was talking about, is the storytelling. But I want the storytelling to be done now from the perspective of Creole women in conservation, or Creole people in general in those communities, and not just in Mauritius, but also beyond. Like, a lot of the work that I do is about letting the communities tell their story themselves, because this is how we change the narrative that Kate was talking about. Like, I think we all shared this, the narrative which is all centered around, like, this community has nothing to offer but suffering, and it has no opportunities in it. It's full of opportunities. It's just about finding the opportunities. And there's a quote that I absolutely love by Chinua Achebe, is like, until the lions get their own historian, the story will always be told from the perspective of the hunter. And this is the kind of work that I want. I want to be able to let people leverage the technology to tell their own story. And I think platforms like StoryMap or web apps that are like easy to deploy really help do that, because it really democratized the technology in a way that is needed for more inclusive storytelling, because stories are being told about these communities, but it's one of sufferings and tragedy, which is true, exists in those communities, but there's also an incredible story of like strength and resilience and history. And we need to shift away from the cultural erasure that has happened and focus and have ways of elevating those people for themselves, by themselves.
I love what you're saying there, Verona. I'd like to add on to it that, and actually Vilko recommended a book, All We Can Save, that when we first met, and it blew my mind, and you folks should check it out. It's really interesting. And I think to add on to that, it's showing the resilience, showing the opportunities, and then showing that like a lot of these communities that have long been maligned have the solutions to the nonsense that, like the hot nonsense that the dominant culture has created in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of capitalist exploitation, in terms of the denigration of our resources. There's also a lot of, there's a shift that I think is starting to happen in terms of the amount of respect that we give to those communities that have long been oppressed by dominant systems. And I think that the storytelling is a really great way to elevate that. And I think in our culture, we haven't always given as much respect to storytelling. It's something that's been seen a little other, maybe a little feminized, which we still live in a patriarchal culture here in the United States. But there's a lot of power in that. So I love that. And I love that lion quote. I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, to add on, I also, oh my gosh, I've never heard that before, Vettel. Thank you for sharing that quote with us. So for us, some of the justice issues that we're working on well, let me backtrack, right? There's a lot of displacement happening in our communities, and it's really unfortunate, right? And I'm starting to notice a pattern of repetition. So when we go out to talk to communities and we're talking about storytelling, we hear a lot of community members say, well, I moved from LA down to here because a warehouse kicked me out, right? And now a warehouse is kicking them out again. And what's going on is a lot of the renters who are in the area are unaware of what's going on. So essentially a warehouse is coming into various communities in the region, but specifically in this one community. And it is going to be displacing, I think it was like 111 or 113 homes. And a lot of them are renters, who have no idea that this is happening, who will not be receiving any financial compensation or anything along those lines for this warehouse that's going to be coming in and that will be demolishing those homes. So it is incredibly serious, and it is incredibly dangerous, especially to the people's health around that project if it does get developed, because of the pollution that's going to come in with the diesel trucks. So that is just one example of stuff that is happening, and that is continuously happening. As I said, right, we're hearing from residents that this has happened to them before. So how come this continues to happen to our community? It is not okay. And so we're fighting back through raising our voice, going to these meetings, talking to residents, talking to decision makers, having different tours, engaging in trainings. It's so much that is going on, and we're fighting for crumbs. Right? Like this is something that shouldn't have to happen. And it continues to happen because of the connections developers have with some decision makers, or sometimes that the way that the money is infiltrated between those deals, right? It's so wrong. And this continues to happen in our community. There's another example where a warehouse is coming next to a high school, and the students are going to be playing tennis while the trucks are idling. It is absolutely criminal. That this continues to happen. So these are some of the justice issues that we're working on. We also work on a couple of different matters unrelated to warehousing, but this is primarily what's happening in our region, at least here in Southern California. And it is incredibly terrifying to me, but fortunately for our community, right, we are all very strong. We all have our voices. We all have so much power. I always like to say this one quote, and I'll wrap up quickly. I say, you are the traffic. So one time I saw this like meme, and it was really funny, and it had a guy sitting in traffic, and it says, when you're sitting in traffic, and he had a normal face on, like he was just kind of annoyed. And then the second portion, it says, when you realize you are the traffic, and he was like, because he's part of the traffic, right? So this is how I kind of speak to folks around this, right? When people think they have no power, and people think, well, I'm only one person, what can I do? And I'm like, you're the traffic, don't you see? Like, if you weren't in that car, if I'm not in the car next to you, You know, if my neighbor is not another car in front of you, then traffic wouldn't exist, right? We seem so little, but we are so powerful. So those are some of the things that we're working on right now. And we need all the good vibes possible because we do not want this to happen in our communities. And yeah, we're just doing the best that we can, but thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. What environmental practices or policies do you see as causing large justice issues currently?
I don't want to take up too much space, but I can jump in if no one else is chomping. Land use. Land use is a huge, huge, huge issue. I know zoning doesn't sound sexy, but I promise it is. And if you're not super familiar with like the zoning in your community, I highly encourage you to check out, because it's pretty much the way that decisions are made about where you can put stuff. Yes, where you can put grocery stores and daycares and marijuana dispensaries and parks, but also where do you put transmitter stations? Also, where do you put the diesel fuel that goes to fuel the airplanes in the airport of your major city? And you will find that the land use disproportionately, this is going to be like a disappointing but not surprising thing, that you'll find that a lot of the land use decisions that are made are the people who have the least amount of political power. So areas with a lot of renters, Black and brown folks, lower income people, immigrants, is where a lot of the pollutants are cited. Do we need this stuff? Like, yeah, kind of. We do. We need the ability to move electricity, and probably need to have transition stations. We need certain tools in order to live kind of the modern life that we live right now, but they are so deeply inequitably distributed. One of the areas that I think is really interesting is in Richmond, California, which is in the Bay Area. They've got they've got a refinery and then also some petrochemical rail yard lines that run from the refinery, bringing oil and bringing other petrochemicals into the United States. And it kind of creates a triangle. You've got a refinery, you've got a petrochemical rail yard, you've got another one, and that area is called the Iron Triangle. That's where the majority of, where a really high proportion of Black residents historically and today have lived in Richmond. So I think the citing of like who's allowed to put stuff where is a pretty big issue, because in the beautiful tree-lined neighborhoods with lots of really big houses, you're not going to find a substation there. You're not going to find anybody storing natural gas in those areas. And it's really important to ask that question, why? How does this get distributed? And if you wouldn't want this thing in your backyard, if you wouldn't want the substation, if you wouldn't want the diesel fuel, you need to also start thinking about, well, where do we put it? Like if you don't want it in your community, lower income folks probably don't want it in theirs, then where do we put it? And then do we need it? And I think that opens up a whole conversation around, you know, why are we continuing to use these toxic things that destroy the earth, that contribute to the greenhouse effect? And why is there so little momentum to move off of these? I think there's a lot of like community organizing momentum, but really the political momentum in the United States is ridiculous and relatively non-existent considering the urgency of the problem. So land use is where it's at. Get into zoning. It's really cool. Make your city stop zoning things for single family. Okay, I'm done.
I'd like to add to what Kate said. Thank you for taking the first go at it. Absolutely agree that land use planning is kind of the start of where a lot of issues stem from. And I think one thing that could be useful for the land use planning folks, planners all around, using a racial equity lens when you do your work. And like understanding the people that live in your community and like, what is the end result? Your end result is, for example, meeting the compost requirements, making sure that, you know, we're composting 75% in California by 2050. Are we going to open up 100 new gigantic facilities that are going to be placed in Black and brown communities? Or are we going to work with smaller communities to create more community gardens so that we can still compost, which is a great thing, but still give benefit back to the communities? And using this kind of racial equity lens, I think, would be super duper helpful, so we don't keep having these issues persist for longer periods of time.
One thing that like a lot of it's funny because, you know, I lived in the US for a while, and I feel that compelled to mark the difference between, like, you know, being from an African country and the US. But then I also realized it's ultimately all connected, because all your land use issue, your policies issue, it also impact African nations and other countries elsewhere, because oftentimes the externalities of living the life and the standard of living in the United States is also, it's such an intensive life that is being lived in the United States. The externalities have to be ported out to other countries to be able to sustain this pace of living. And kind of a bit in that line is one thing that I think is quite damaging, and I see a lot in conservation, is how the myth of wild and tame Africa has been kind of pushed forward. It's like, well, there's no human in it, like it's untouched. And this image exists for tourism, like, because we want to make the Western world feel like this is how Africa is supposed to be. But if you look at the dark history of a lot of like nonprofits, like long-term nonprofits, they have actually actively displaced a lot of local communities in the natural environment to create those protected areas. So this idea of untouched nature where there's no one in it and it's just for it's privilege. It's like you cutting access to indigenous communities and local communities to their space where they lived for hundreds of years, displacing them and then telling them that they now need to live differently, but also sustain themselves in a new environment. And then you will also even kind of put back the burden on them of human wildlife conflict and like trafficking of like animals, and it's just very damaging that there's this concept of like outdoor spaces of like it should be pristine and untouched and has no human in it. Like, no, that's something that I don't like about conservation, because communities had been living in this forest for hundreds of years. We are keeping it untouched for the entertainment of a select few. It's not really untouched. And that is something I want to break the myth of this wild Africa, because Africa is a very diverse country. There's 54 countries on the mainland Africa, and each have very different habitat, ecosystem, just like the United States. And just like the United States doesn't have like untouched lands because there were natives here. We need to recognize that everywhere else in the world, we can't just create those bubbles and exclude communities.
I like where you're going with that. The whole, I've always had a thorn in my side about environmentalism as consumption, which feels like a very kind of like white supremacist patriarchal view of viewing the land. The idea that all of the joy that we should gather from wilderness or from wild spaces should be like able to fit into a postcard or be able to fit into like a selfie behind you. And it kind of ignores not just that, like, yes, the people there. And I think the approach that we really should take is people-centered. Because like, honestly, if we're trying to get people to care about the environment, I don't think folks are like care like that much about like polar bears or about like species of toads. Those are really important environmental indicators and we should care. But taking a people-centered approach is also really big. Like, how do the decisions that we make around conservation or land use impact not just the people who are consuming it, but also the people that are living it or were living it or want to be living in it. So yeah, that's always been a thorn in my side.
Yeah, it's also really interesting, Beto, what you mentioned around these visitor locations. I actually recently learned, where I feel like we're always learning things, even if we're in this space constantly. I recently learned that the Grand Canyon displaced indigenous folks. And I found out also that they have running water at the Grand Canyon for visitors, and it's free, so you can fill it up. I've never been there myself, but you can fill it up. And the people that were displaced do not have proper clean running water. So that's a problem, right? Like, they removed people from this area to make sure that it was a visitor site, blah, blah, blah. Of course, you know, I don't think people are actually living in the Grand Canyon, but around it, right? To make it a national site for visitors to come. And this is so incredibly wrong. Why is this happening? Why is no one talking about this, right? I think things like that need to be addressed. So I just wanted to kind of bring on to that point that you mentioned, Vero, about that preservation or wanting to create these visitor sites, but what is the history behind it, and how can we start to fix what happened by providing those services to those communities and more, right? So that's a bigger conversation to have, but I definitely think it's an important one to have.
Thanks for all those really good points about conservation. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to just get to a couple more questions maybe quickly. What's something that keeps you hopeful?
All of you, honestly. Each time I meet people like you, I just feel like there's a lot of potential for collective work, because we don't exactly work in the same career track, and it can be a very alienating path, environmental justice, in a lot of ways, even in your own organization, because it takes a lot of like vulnerability. So having these conversations give me a lot of hope, because it reinforces that it's a work that needs to be done, and that there's other people who really want to do it alongside me.
I would second Vero there. A lot of times in environmental justice work, climate justice work, it feels lonely. And I think meeting people like you all and all the people that are listening to this panel right now, because you are interested, you're hopeful, you want to find solutions for where you work, that definitely inspires me that there are more people out there that care than my pessimistic brain keeps telling me. So
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. What is something that you wish more people knew?
I will go. Something I wish more people knew is how much power you actually hold. It is me as an immigrant woman, and as someone who lives in this community, right, in an underserved community. For a long time, I believed I had no power. I thought, well, I can't vote, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't even travel outside the country and go see what's going on over there. I felt so limited. But truly, I wish, what I wish more people knew, and what I wish I knew back then when I was 11 years old and I carried a little pin that said, I love clean air on my backpack. What I wish that girl would have known is, you're going to change. You're going to create so much change, and you're going to trailblaze for so many other young women that are coming after you. Right. I think that is something that I want to say. I'm even getting chills like thinking about it, because I get so excited about it. I get so excited to see everyone on this call and everyone who's here watching this today. Just know that you have so much power and so much capability, regardless of your immigration status, gender, whatever it may be, culture. You will hold so much power. Truly, I mean it. Your voice means something. It doesn't matter, every feeling that you have, every concern that you have in your community, it's for a reason, right? Don't question yourself. Go with your intuition. Follow your intuition. If something doesn't seem right, if you have if you're living in a food desert where you have more liquor stores than you have, access to clean food, or more options, right? You can question that. Follow your gut, and just know that your concerns are valid. Know that you can raise your voice, and it is in your rights to go to these decision makers and tell them what you need, because our taxes pay them, like we are technically their boss. So we have to be like, hey, you're doing your job wrong. I'm going to be on you. I'm going to hold you accountable. You're polluting my people, right? You're going to have blood on your hands if you continue to do this. So I just wish people knew I just wish people knew they have so much power. Truly, I wish I knew that at 11 years old, but I know that now, which is important. I learned it sometime, right? But every individual person holds so much power and capability, and nothing is limited to you. There is change coming. So just really happy to be on here with all of you, and I'll shut up now so someone else can add.
I'm also very happy to be here. And one of the powers that you have, like Gabby is saying, is to explore communities that, like, to step outside of your comfort zone and explore communities And you might think like, oh, well, this is hard, but being on this call right now is exploring communities that are not necessarily yours. And unless there's a Mauritian on the call, if so, I salute you. But like, even then, there are differences even amongst us, and exploring that is really important. And when you do explore other communities, don't go out there and like question them. Just like, if they invite you to listen, you listen. And I say listen, and there's a difference between listening and hearing. Listening is like a conscious act. You know, it has intentionality. Hearing is a physiological response, like you can hear but not listen. So that is one of your power, to listen and to just be present in spaces where you're invited, like today, to listen.
Jaimie or Cate, do either of you have kind of a main takeaway for the people on the call?
Yeah, if you're really overwhelmed, then you're paying good attention. I think that there's this, and also this is going to take a long time, even though I think one of the things that I really struggle with is there's this huge discordance between the urgency and the pace at which things move, but processes are going to be kind of slow. So really you need to focus on how to sustain yourself and be in it for the long haul. I think we all wish that we could, had the panacea, but there is no panacea. There's no 100% solution for this. The best we're going to get is cobbling together a series of 1% solutions and hoping that it happens fast enough to sort of tilt the bucket. So you need to figure out how you can be that 1%, and don't get overwhelmed by the fact that there's 99 to go, because there's other folks that are working on that 1% too.
Gosh, I don't think I could have worded it better than Cate, so I'm just not going to try to reword that.
Great. We have about 12 minutes left now, and they will just cut it off at that time. So we're going to move to question and answer. Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Awesome. Thank you. I have chills. So let's start. I'm going to go in order based on upvotes of the Q&A. So the first question is, what advice do you have for someone who wants to change career paths to become more involved in environmental justice?
I would say I chose to start looking into environmental justice, and I started looking at a lot of the systemic problems first. And my advice would be start with the self and then go with the system, because it takes a lot of like self-care to not fall into the trap of like, this is all doom and gloom. So be really mindful, like finding a really mindful, supportive group, and self-care, like start with yourself, like your own implicit biases, your own healing. It might sound like a weird career advice, but I genuinely feel like I wish someone had given me like the advice to take care of myself more, and to be more aware of like what identities I hold and how that's gonna come into conflict into trying to do environmental justice work while remaining impartial, which is impossible, but you gotta try. So that's my advice.
I have a friend, Allison, who has this theory that there are kind of two types of people. Really, it's a spectrum, but stick with me, that you've got people who are skill people and people who are mission people. And skill people are like, I love to program, and I don't care if I'm doing it for like a shelter for cats or for Amazon. And you've got people who are mission people, people who are interested in, working on helping to get, animals rehomed. And it doesn't matter if they're mopping floors and feeding the cats to do it, or if they are like out there trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from donors. And you need to figure out like where you are on that spectrum, because all skills are needed within the mission. So you need to figure out which part of those is more motivating to you and figure out where you are on that spectrum. Also, that spectrum is going to change throughout your career. And at some point, you're going to be more interested in whatever skill side really brings you energy. I also like to talk, you probably are familiar with like the cliche interview question, like what's your strength? What's your weakness? I'd like you to flip the way that you're thinking about strength and weakness, with strength being something that strengthens you, something that gives you energy, it makes you energized, it brings joy to your life. I'm not saying every day at work is going to be a walk in the park, and sure as heck, not every day in the EJ field is a walk in the park, but that should sort of like energize you, versus your weaknesses or things that just sort of drain you and you hate it. For me, it's like anything dealing with like financial forensics, like keep those Excel sheets away from me. I'm not here for it. And so focus on that as well when you're trying to balance that in the field. Also know that all skills are needed in this work. So if you are someone who really loves to do GIS work and you love to do mapping, there's a huge role for you. If you're someone who likes to be on the, hey, I'm going to program and figure out like the R code to make that GIS go faster, there's a role for you. You like to talk a lot, there's a role for you in this space as well. So I promise that there's lots of different skills. So don't be discouraged because you see one person who's successful who embodies a certain skill or version of the mission. There's room for you in this space, I promise.
Awesome, thank you. If there's no one else that wants to have input on that, we can go to the next one. How can we support environmental justice without initiating gentrification?
I don't want to take up too much space, but I have a lot of opinions about gentrification. So I can also, anybody else? I think gentrification is a little bit of a red herring. I think that when we think about it, we think about like white guys with ironic mustaches and their husky puppies like coming into a space, and like that's a part of the cultural consciousness. But we really need to think about like land use decisions. Someone owns that land. Someone is making the choice to raise rents. Right? It's not the market. There's no invisible hand of the market that happens that makes some sort of a decision. People are choosing to charge more for this, and people are also choosing to restrict the ability to build more units of housing, to build more rental, to build more things that you can purchase. The organization that I work for, Groundwork, and you should hop on our website, groundworkusa.org, to see if there's a trust near you. We build green spaces. That's a big part of what we do, is transitioning contaminated land and working with community members to develop it into community assets like parks and trails and urban farms. So this is a huge issue for us. And you can't work on environmental justice and improving the environment unless you're working with the housing people. Like find the housing people and work with the housing people, because gentrification is not this like mysterious force. It is a really clear and identifiable group of people. And in the United States, we have really good access to land ownership records. You know who owns this land, and you need to be working either with or against some of these folks about their decision to increase their property values. And you also need to figure out what your values are behind it. I know that some folks in our network, they're really interested in, hey, there's a really big wealth gap between Black residents and white residents, and these increased property values give us a chance to close that wealth gap. That's a value. You want people to be able to take advantage of it. Some places like in Denver, hey, it's crazy, it's out of control, the gentrification and displacement, the land use values, regardless of what green infrastructure we put in there. How do we decommodify land so that people can stay in their homes? So you need to work with the housing people, and you also need to figure out what your values are. Do you want those properties to values to rise, so people who have not had access to this money can finally get their hands on this intergenerational wealth that they've been denied? Do you think that maybe land ownership is kind of silly and we should decommodify the land? Do you feel somewhere in between? So I think working really closely with the housing people, figuring out what your values are, and recognizing that like the quote unquote free market doesn't exist, and that it's real specific people who have disproportionate control over land use, is a really important part of greening and improving the built environment, while still recognizing that folks have a right to their home. Even if you're a renter, that's your home, and you have a right to be in that space, and you have a right to live there. And I'm, yeah, sorry, I could go on for like 10 years. I feel very strongly about this issue, but I'll stop in case anyone else wants to also get on their soapbox.
Yeah, for me, I think, well, that's a really tough question, right? I think it's something that we need to figure out. But I think I think, Kate, you handled it perfectly. Also, I wanted to add to really pay attention to your general plan. A lot of cities are rethinking, or they're coming up with their general plans right now. They have to do it every couple of years, I believe. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I'm still learning about this whole thing, how this whole process works. But really pay attention to that. Look at also multi-cost housing. A lot of times they'll bring in really unaffordable housing, right, coming into your community. So if you are looking into multi-family housing or multi-cost, where they have varying income levels, that is another option that can be looked at. And that is also a type of environmental justice, right? That is also something that comes out from environmental justice. So just pay attention to that. Be involved in those conversations where you push for affordable housing in varying communities, right? Not only in this community or that community, but varying communities. So that is the way that you can fight that, is paying attention to that, attending those meetings. Usually, like right now, I know, for instance, a couple of our cities here in the region are developing their general plan, and they're looking at finally bringing in an environmental justice perspective to it. And within that, there is affordable housing. So I just really recommend showing up to those meetings and pushing for that, pushing for those efforts. And, you know, it's fairly simple going in saying, I'm here to support this because X, Y, and Z. And there's a lot of research that can be done around it. I'm still doing a lot of research myself around this to have a better understanding. It is a lot to tackle, but nonetheless, I think it is definitely important. And if you're trying to fight gentrification, I think that's something that is a good place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our next question, we have a few minutes left. Every state in the US has an environmental agency, as do many provinces in many countries. How do you help these agencies take their existing work and efforts towards transparency and expand it to cover the definition of environmental justice?
Well, there need to be more collaboration, and and for collaboration to happen, those agencies must be willing to share their data and to create platform that invites feedback. And that is the challenge, right? Like, who owns the data and like who collected the data? That is two big challenges. Is like, how do you foster collaboration without standardizing how you collect the data? And if you're standardizing how you collect the data, who was involved in the data collection process? Who was at the table? But most importantly, who wasn't at the table when you collected this data? And as long as like everyone operates in a silo, like globally, it makes it really challenging because environmental issues don't have borders. They don't like walk across the states and be like, okay, this is New York, I'm not going as far as New York, like this is pollution, I'm going to just stick in New York. And this is not how environmental issues work. This is not how climate change work. And because of that, like a lot of states are laggards when it comes to how they approach their data collection or how inclusive there is. And the ones that are leaders in that respect are still set back because there's no standardization or an inclusive approach to data collection. So it's probably not like an extremely positive answer, but what I'm trying to say is that it is possible if we start having more inclusive methods and standardized methods of collecting data, but also sharing this data, but having participatory framework to collect this data. And it's definitely possible with just seeing a lot of the sessions around racial equity in the last few days. I know there's a lot of hope around like creating this kind of collaborative work.
Amazing. Thank you. It looks like we're out of time, unfortunately, and we couldn't get to all the questions, but we also wanted to share, Grace, if you wanted to talk about the other sessions. Thank you so much for everyone for being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much to all our panelists and everyone for attending. There's a few more diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice SIGs today you can see on this slide. So the Asian Desi Pacific Islander one is coming up soon. And then later on, we have North Star and Blacks in GIS. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and participating.